Welcome to SpyCast, the official podcast of the International Spy Museum. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Hammond, the museum's historian and curator. Every week, we explore some aspect of the past, present, or future of intelligence and espionage. Please subscribe to the show if you haven't already, and consider leaving us a 5-star review so that other listeners can find us. Coming up next on SpyCast.
We had an intelligence intervention which stopped a car and made some arrests and seized an improvised mortar. And what was, I guess, most significant about this, it was very close proximity to the border. This mortar was of a new type that we hadn't seen before.
This week is the third instalment of our 5-week-long Spy Chief series. It started off with former CIA Director David Petraeus. The second week featured former Director General of Kenya's National Intelligence Service, Wilson Boinett. And we will continue next week with former number 2 of India's Research and Analysis Wing, Vipala Balachandran, before closing out with the first woman to be the head of a US intelligence agency, Tish Long. This week's guest is Michael McElgunn. He oversees the major intelligence component of Garda Síochána, which is Ireland's national police and security service. Michael joined in 1991 and has made his way to the highest levels of the organisation as Assistant Commissioner. He has a first-class honours degree in police leadership from University College Dublin, and he's also a graduate of the FBI National Academy here in the States and the UK College of Policing. In this episode, Michael and I discuss intelligence on the island of Ireland, the Garda's role in the Troubles, the Garda's role in counter-terrorism, counterintelligence and counter-espionage, and the importance of the Garda's American, British and European partners. The original podcast on intelligence since 2006, we are SpyCast. Now sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Okay, I'm so pleased to speak to you, Michael. It was a pleasure to meet you when you were over here in the States earlier this year. So thanks ever so much for coming on the show. And I really look forward to speaking to you about Garda in Ireland and Irish intelligence.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm delighted to be here and great to get this opportunity to do this podcast with you. I think there will certainly be information of relevance and interest, particularly to people in the US with Irish connections and Irish history.
One of them is sitting right next to me just now. Okay. So let's just start at the top. So for a lot of our listeners that aren't familiar, tell them what the Garda is. Tell them just a little bit about the Garda before we start digging into what you do and the intelligence functions of it.
Sure, yeah. The Garda Síochána actually is the full title, and that's a Gaelic expression which means guardians of the peace. And we are the policing and security service of the Irish state, and that's defined in law. And so there's no other police service in the Republic of Ireland. And then that security service, which is the department that I head up, Internal Service, is known as the Garda National Crime Security and Intelligence Service. And I might talk a little bit about that in a moment. So the Garda Síochána as an organisation, and colloquially known in Ireland as the Guards, has celebrated its centenary last year. And during our 100 years, 89 members of the organisation have been killed in the execution of their duty on behalf of the Irish state. And some of those were by terrorists associated with Northern Ireland-related terrorism, including groupings such as the Provisional IRA and the Irish National Liberation Army. And in terms of numbers, there are about 15,000 sworn officers in Garda Síochána and about 3,000 support staff. And then there's also 500 reserve officers who support. And so that's the whole, the figures for the whole organisation, if you like. And because it's a policing and security service, then the oversight mechanisms are slightly different. In terms of the wider policing organisation, there's about 500 police stations across the state, and that's a state of 5 million people. So you can see from those figures, this is very strong community focus in policing, and therefore by extension security service throughout the country. That strong community policing focus, and that's sort of demonstrated in some of the public attitude surveys. So, for example, 83% of 18 to 24-year-olds are satisfied with policing in Ireland. 91% of all respondents in a survey of 7,500 people trust on Garda Síochána. And then in terms of criminality and behaviour, in Ireland there was 69 homicides in 2022, so that gives people internationally sort of a context in terms of the criminality here. While I think policing services worldwide may have taken somewhat of a battering in terms of public attitudes, it in fact went the other way for us during that time. So, and when I say us, that is again because the security service and the Garda Síochána, we are the one agency. And then in terms of governance structure, there is a single commissioner responsible for the whole organisation and both components of the organisation. There's 2 deputy commissioners and a chief administrative officer. There's 4 regional assistant commissioners, so they take responsibility for geographical parts of the country. There's an assistant commissioner for serious and organised crime. There's one for community relations and roads policing. There's one in governance and accountability. And then there's me, and I am the head of the Garda National Crime Security and Intelligence Service, as I mentioned earlier on.
Last but definitely not least.
I would hope not, anyway, but we work together pretty collaboratively.
And just before we go any further, just a couple of follow-up questions. So you mentioned the commissioner there, and I find the current commissioner just historically quite interesting. So for our listeners, his father was murdered by the IRA in 1989, I think it was. The current commissioner, Drew Harris, he was an RUC officer who went on to become the deputy head of the Police Service Northern Ireland. So the Garda commissioners that have came before him are a little bit different, and I'm sure that none of this is lost on people in the Garda Síochána and on you. So I just wondered if you could tell our listeners what's going on there. They might be like, oh, that's kind of interesting. That's unusual.
Yeah. Well, you're quite correct. Drew Harris is our commissioner, and he has been the commissioner for 5 years, almost 5 years now. And his tenure has been extended by another 2 years, so he will do 2 further years with us. And you're quite right, he comes from Northern Ireland. His dad was blown up by an IRA bomb, and he has served in the Royal Irish Constabulary, which then subsequently was assimilated into the police service of Northern Ireland after the various initiatives under the peace process in Northern Ireland. There had then, I think, prior to his arrival down here, been a period of complaints and reviews and some independent examinations of policing here. And I think at that point, an open competition was run for the position of Garda Commissioner, and the policing authority who assisted government in running that competition went internationally to look at candidates for the posting. And I think there might have been a short list of about 3 candidates, I think all of whom were actually international at that stage. And then the Commissioner, Drew Harris, was the successful candidate. So he comes from the vast majority of people in the Republic of Ireland come from a nationalist Catholic background, whereas the Commissioner comes from a Protestant background in Northern Ireland. But while that might have been something of relevance at one time, that's less the case now. In the modern era, he brings a lot of rich experience in policing and, in fact, served for some time in Police Scotland as well. So there's a huge experience in that international context.
Yeah, I just think it's an interesting story. And in terms of within Ireland, it's broken down into 4 regions. There's the Dublin Metropolitan Region, Eastern, Southern and Northwestern. And then, as you mentioned, there's a commissioner that oversees this. So I was just wondering as well, what's the onboarding process like for Garda officers? You know, is there like a standard training? Does everybody have to be a Bobby on the beat? Does everybody have to join up, do the same training, spend some time on the street, and then you can specialize in intelligence or counterintelligence or any of the other branches that you spoke about? Just help me understand how that works.
Yeah, in fact, we currently have a recruiting program ongoing for 1,000 officers. So it is very much as you've indicated. Everybody joins at what we call Garda level, so that's constable or officer level. They go through a training program, which is a degree program, run over a couple of years. And that involves some modules where they are out in training stations and then return to the Central Training College, which is in County Tipperary. And then after a period of time on frontline policing, individuals then become qualified to apply for positions in specialised roles. So we, for example, in the Garda National Crime Security and Intelligence Service, we would recruit primarily from the wider policing organisation. So we advertise internally, and then we look to select candidates. In addition, we take candidates a direct entrance into the security hub, particularly analysts or people with specialist language skills or etc. So, but there, we have a strong blend with a heavy focus on people coming from the policing community focused background. And then people make their way through the ranks. So we all join at the same level and you work your way up through the ranks. In recent years, some of the senior positions from Chief Superintendent, Assistant Commissioner, there have been, the competitions have been open to members of the Police Service of Northern Ireland as well. And so we have some colleagues here who have spent their careers policing in Northern Ireland. But in each case, they also have had full careers in policing, so they're not lateral entrants, if you like, into the positions. But at the senior leadership level of the organisation, we do have what we call Garda staff or senior civilian colleagues at executive director level in around HR, legal, our chief medical officer, and others, director of communications and strategic transformation. So there is a blend at that level. The other thing I guess it's useful for an American audience in particular to be mindful of that our officers are generally unarmed. So the officers on the street are unarmed by and large. Detectives can carry firearms, and we also have an armed support resource and capacity, which actually is also under my remit, and that's deployed nationwide. They are in a slightly different uniform to the regular officers. They drive different vehicles, and so they're identifiable as armed officers, and they carry MP7s and sidearms and have other capacity around 40mm launchers and tasers. So that blend. And then finally, we also have a very specialist, and I was going to mention them later, our emergency response unit, which also is under my remit. So that's the top tier intervention team, which is, relatively small capacity by international standards, but that's also there for particular areas of concern and interventions where the risks are particularly high.
And for the recruitment of the 1,000 officers, do you have to be an Irish national, or can people from Northern Ireland also join, or people from the UK? Or I think Erin was getting quite excited when you mentioned that there. Could Irish Americans join? Is it like the Irish football team, or do you have to have been born there?
No, we're quite open. In fact, our recent recruitment campaign has been altered slightly to allow people who are in Ireland on international protection, in other words, people who are here in this country as refugees, may apply to join Garda Síochána. Now, obviously, vetting becomes a little more complicated depending on the countries that people come from. And I think we have about 30 different nationalities represented in the organisation. There is, of course, enhanced vetting requirements before you move into some of the specialist roles, including the roles under my remit, and sometimes so for people who come from countries where there may not be particularly stable governments. that vetting process can be challenging, and that can pose a difficulty.
So just going on to yourself now, how did you end up overseeing all of these intelligence components? So you join up as a constable. I guess that you've rotated around a few different things, or was it more you found that you had an aptitude or a liking for the intelligence stuff, so you stayed in a particular stream? How does that work? How does one end up doing what you're doing compared to just doing more straightforward domestic crime and so forth?
Yeah, well, I've 32 years service in the organisation now, and I've had roles on both the policing side and on the security service side of the coin. And I've been fortunate enough to work in our Criminal Assets Bureau, which is a bureau seizing assets from organised crime figures. I've worked in serious crime investigations over the years, and also at various police stations, almost all of them in Dublin. I haven't served outside of the Dublin metropolitan area to any great extent. And in fact, I was a chief superintendent, which is sort of the senior operational manager in Dublin city centre for about 2 years throughout COVID and to the end of COVID before I was promoted to assistant commissioner. So in and out, if you like. Generally speaking, the people in the security and service, security and intelligence side hold detective appointments. And on promotion from a detective appointment, our general rule is you must go back for a while into frontline uniform policing. And that's designed to sort of share experiences, but also to help people develop as they go along. So I had been involved in crime investigations and the Criminal Assets Bureau when I was promoted to a sergeant back in around 2004, I think. And I really was looking for a new path or something different. The Security and Intelligence Department at that time tended to be exceptionally secretive, and it was pretty opaque in terms of how you applied or how you entered or even what they did. And so when I was asked by a senior officer if I would have an interest in working in the area, I really had to ask, well, what precisely is it that they do and what would be required of me and etc., how I might be a fit for it. And when I came in first, I led a team dealing with intelligence around Northern Ireland related terrorism, and that was sort of my early, and that at that time was sort of busy business area because it was the Good Friday Agreement had happened, but a number of fractious dissident groups that had broken away from the IRA were active. And it was certainly, the focus was on those groups. So that was an interesting, dynamic time. And so to answer your question in a roundabout way, I suppose I found myself developing a level of interest and intrigue in what is a very different world from that of policing. It's closer in many respects to diplomacy. It is, very analytical. It is slow burning in terms particularly of hostile intelligence behaviour. The Northern Ireland related terrorist activity tended to be dynamic, faster moving, and certainly was more exciting and closer to investigating organised crime. And then the general international counter-terrorist stuff, around support activity, fundraising, assisting people in travel, that wider procurement, slower burning stuff, money laundering, and that really put a lot of focus into collaboration with partner services, sharing of information, collective development, and looking at strategies around trying to prevent radicalization, etc.
Help me understand, as you look at the world now, what are the intelligence components of Garda, Síochána? Help our listeners understand the different things that are going on: counter-espionage, counter-terrorism, counterintelligence, clandestine activity, some of the other constituent parts you mentioned, the National Surveillance Unit. So we don't need to go at that all at once, but just at the top level, what are the intelligence components that are under your remit?
Yeah, well, there's 4 divisions essentially operating under my sort of business area. We have the Special Detective Unit, more commonly known as a Special Branch, and that operates under a Detective Chief Superintendent. So they are, if you like, the law enforcement, the investigative side of national security. So they are the ones who will do the interventions, the arrests, the detentions, bring the matters before the court. And then they also have departments then dedicated to the different investigations in the different threat areas. So, be that counterterrorism or counterintelligence or terrorism specifically related to Northern Ireland are in that department. Then the Security and Intelligence Department, that's under, again, a second Detective Chief Superintendent. So that essentially is the intelligence unit, ring-fenced sort of secure department within headquarters facility. That recruitment is from the wider policing organisation with some specialist supports in terms of languages, technology, analytics and that sort of thing. And that's the branch of Garda Síochána then that partners with security services internationally. So that might be bilaterally or multilateral platforms at the European level. And then, externally, for example, the UK is outside of Europe now, but we've an exceptionally strong bilateral arrangement and engagements with the UK and then also in the United States. So MI5 in the UK, in the US, the FBI, but also the Central Intelligence Agency and other state agencies as well in the US, depending on what the particular intelligence channel might be. And that unit is also the home to our national surveillance units. So they take over that human and technical surveillance activity. And they're responsible then for that general intelligence cycle that would be well understood by people in the intelligence business. So, that tasking or targeting and gathering of information from CHIS, technical surveillance, or international partnerships. So that sharing, which is more and more important now in a globalized world. The third area, the division under my remit then, is our Special Tactics and Operation Command. Again, there's a Detective Chief Superintendent in charge of that. And that is our specialist firearms intervention. It also has our National Negotiator units, the Emergency Response Unit, which is top-tier intervention team with all of those specialist intervention skills that you would expect, as was the case in the recent visit of President Biden. That is the team that would work closely with the Secret Service in terms of providing those high-level VIPs with protection while they're in the state. We also then have a Liaison and Protection Division, that's under a Detective Chief Superintendent as well. And that has sort of that GTAG so that's the tactical assessment on security. So they're looking at security standards. Our Major Emergency Management Department, Protective Services, International Liaison is under that department as well. So that would include our Europol and Interpol national offices. So in summary, that's the various departments.
Michael just mentioned Interpol, but what is it? If you're lucky, you may have heard of the famous red notices that they issue, or recall the term from some movie or newspaper that you watched in the past. Interpol was founded in 1923 and is celebrating its 100th anniversary. Interpol is short for International Criminal Police Organisation. Essentially, it facilitates international police cooperation and the exchange of information. For example, you have a precious work of art, a Rembrandt, a Monet, that just so happens to be hanging above Grandma's ashes on the mantelpiece. But it gets stolen. The chances are pretty strong that it will end up in a different country. That's okay, because Interpol has a global stolen art database that law enforcement in your own country, or any other country really, can access. In fact, almost every country in the world is a member of Interpol. On its centenary, Interpol helped take down an international art trafficking operation, which led to over 60 arrests and the recovery of over 11,000 cultural objects. Some of the objects recovered were 77 ancient books in Italy that had been stolen from a monastery, over 3,000 ancient coins seized from an online sales platform by Polish police, and dozens of religious artefacts linked to a series of church robberies in Portugal. No less than 14 countries' law enforcement organisations were involved in this enterprise. And is there like a CIA MI6 component to Garda Síochána, so foreign intelligence gathering, recruiting agents in overseas capitals and so forth?
No, we are, in law, the policing and security service, and the security activities or security services activities are actually defined in legislation, and those are principally internal security in focus. So it clearly is the intention of government that we are an internally focused service. So that focuses in around protecting the state from acts of terrorism within the state, but also acts of espionage, sabotage, behaviour that would undermine the financial well-being of the state. So they are all principally internally focused. The national structure, in terms of ultimately, as within any other country, national security rests with government. It is a government responsibility. And in Ireland, there is a department recently established in relatively recent years under the Taoiseach or Prime Minister's office, and that's the National Security Assessment Centre. So the various actors of state, be that the military, who have an intelligence component, the various departments of foreign affairs, the National Cyber Security Centre, or ourselves in the Garda National Crime Security and Intelligence Service, we collaborate under the strategic direction of that office.
So Ireland doesn't have a separate foreign intelligence gathering agency?
No, we don't. But the military do have an intelligence component, which will be more externally focused, and particularly in around areas where military people or Irish interests are deployed.
What's the report structure like? So in the States, you have the CIA, central quote-unquote intelligence. They centralise it, and then there's a presidential daily briefer. Every day the president will get a brief on things that are happening around the country, around the world. Like, how does the information get to the Taoiseach? Do you report to the commissioner, or is it someone within your team that goes every day over to the Taoiseach, or you, or just help me understand the flow of information.
Yeah, well, the on the operational side, essentially the commissioner has responsibility, and so our reports are to him on operational activity, and then on strategic matters or operational matters that are going to be of concern sort of nationally, there are briefings to the minister. And so those principally are done by the commissioner. I will accompany him to those meetings, or they're also done at a senior official level. So there's designated senior officials within the Department of Justice with whom we engage on the various secure channels to give those briefings. So those are, there's contact daily, I guess, but more formalized briefings tend to relate to any particular threat that might be emerging or any particular matters of concern. So there are some that are set in the diary, if you like, but then they may well be more frequent if there's a particular matter of concern ongoing.
You mentioned that in the business area of Northern Ireland and the troubles that takes up quite a bit of time and a bit of resources. Can you just help our listeners understand that a little bit more? So does that mean that there's particular parts of Garda Síochána that are around the border region or that are collaborating with PSNI to deal with the issues that are going on there? Or help our listeners just understand that just a little bit more, the parts of your branch that are focused on that relationship?
Yeah. Well, on the policing side, there is very strong cross-border connections, and for some time before I came into this role as an assistant commissioner, I was responsible for that border area, and so there are engagements then with counterparts in the PSNI on the policing side at strategic, tactical, and operational level, and these are happening sort of every day at the operational level, and there's joint initiatives around checkpoints so that they are done in partnership and that there's an effective operational sharing of information, again, on the policing side. And then on the intelligence side, one of my business areas, that security and intelligence area, engage with MI5, and they are sharing that information, that intelligence. Again, that's daily. Meetings are very, very regular. That is a relationship that has got stronger and stronger in my time here, and there's a lot of very good support there. So you can have intelligence material shared. You can have joint strategies around who we collectively believe might be individuals or groupings who pose a threat to that security environment, and to jointly sort of target those groups and those individuals. So, there's a number of them. They're still active. So there's one grouping which uses the term Ógla na hÉireann, which is unhelpful because that is actually the official title of the Irish Defence Forces, but it is used by one of these IRA groupings. And there's another one then, the New IRA, another called the so-called Real IRA, and then to a lesser extent the Irish National Liberation Army, which was at one time a more significant player, and then some other smaller factions. So there's one called Arm na Phoblaachta, which is another a smaller grouping. All of those are groupings that are hostile to the Good Friday Agreement process. They all have their origins in a split, really, at the ruling Army Council of the Provisional IRA at the time of the strategy. Once that decision was made to go down that road, that led to splits, and those groups then emerged principally from splits within themselves in the years that have followed. And in terms of examples, one of those groupings that are referred to as far back as 2010, in the wintertime, I can recall it because there was quite a bit of snow in the border area. We had an intelligence intervention with our that national unit, the Emergency Response Unit, which stopped a car and made some arrests and seized an improvised mortar. And what was, I guess, most significant about this, it was very close proximity to the border. This mortar was of a new type that we hadn't seen before, and it used airbag canisters from a Volkswagen car as sort of, the propulsion that would drive the warhead out of the mortar tube. And so we knew we had a difficulty in that. This was a new design that we hadn't seen before, and it clearly was in the context of a transfer from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland, which suggested there was engineering capacity in the Republic of Ireland. And so that, while an operational success, was a worry. And a lot of very deep analysis, review of metadata, applying, very modern analytics, and then identifying a group of individuals and an intense period of surveillance continued for the best part of sort of 9 months after that event. And then there was a series of searches, principally in the south of Ireland, the south part of the Republic of Ireland, if you know what I mean. A number of arrests made there. And during those searches and arrests, we discovered schematic design for this what we titled a Mark 21 mortar. That whole network was disrupted in this series of arrests. There was one significant conviction associated with this.
And you mentioned earlier that 100 or over 100 Garda officers had died in the century the Garda has been around, and you mentioned that some of them were killed by the IRA. For our listeners, have Garda officers been targeted by, loyalist terrorists or Republican terrorists or both, or the ones that have died? Has it been like killed the officers, but they were, quote unquote collateral damage? They weren't the intended target. Yeah, just help us understand the officers who've fallen, how they intersect with, Republican and loyalist terrorist groups.
We haven't any experience of loyalist groupings targeting Garda officers, but then they have not been operationally active in this jurisdiction other than a couple of bombing incidents, and they were quite controversial, and they are well back in the years. So we haven't seen that behaviour. The Provisional IRA was a disciplined organisation, if you can use that term in respect of a terrorist outfit, and it operated to what they call the Green Book. And the Green Book principally prohibited them from engaging Gardaí or members of the Irish military as targets. Now, there was a rationale behind that, of course, because the IRA in its early days and its inception when it emerged in 1969 was relying on public support in its behaviour. And they were mindful, of course, that the Irish public had a good relationship with its police force. So they knew that the targeting of members of the Gardaí or the Irish Defence Forces was likely to be counterproductive in terms of their public support. And I think the same thing could be said true that they were keen to avoid mass casualty types event, because they knew that whatever support they might get from misguided individuals who might support the murder of a police officer or a soldier in Northern Ireland, as abhorrent and all that might be to any of the rest of us, some individuals might support that. But if that were to become a mass attack in which women and children and non-combatants were to be killed, they knew that public support would evaporate fast. And ultimately, that is really the way things have played out for some of these dissident groupings as well, particularly in the light of the attack in Omagh in 1998. But so that doesn't mean the Provisional IRA didn't kill members of Garda Síochána. They did. But it could happen in the context of fundraising activities here. So they were robbing post offices and banks, and Gardaí responded to those incidents. In the context of kidnappings, where Gardaí were involved in searches to try and release individuals from their captors, so indiscriminate firing in the general direction, and Gardaí and indeed members of the Defence Forces were killed in that context. Then the dissident groupings do not enjoy any particular level of structured, disciplined approach to their behaviour, and tend to be have greater autonomy in how they conduct their business. That said, they are also less sophisticated in terms of their approach and strategies. That a lot of the people with the experience from the Provisional IRA, be that engineering or in the operational field, they supported the peace approach, and many of those who went down the road of dissent or the so-called dissident Republican groupings were not, in many cases, those who had that background experience, and in some they tended to be younger volunteers. There were some notable exceptions. There were some individuals who were quite experienced.
I just want to talk a little bit more about foreign in the sense of from different islands other than the British or the island of Ireland. So here in the States, we're always reading stories about Chinese industrial espionage, Russian, intelligence officers active in Washington, D.C. Obviously with the diplomats in any capital city, you have people who are really diplomats and people who are posing as diplomats but who are really intelligence officers trying to gather intelligence for their home country. So I just wondered if you could just talk us through some of those things that you're dealing with. So domestic counter-espionage, counterintelligence against foreign adversaries, or let's not use the term adversaries, just people that are trying to take information that the Irish government and the Irish people don't want them to take. What's the threat landscape like for your branch, Michael?
Yeah. Well, look, it's no surprise that we're not unique. We don't stand alone. That those malign threat actors exist in all countries, and they exist here in the same way that they do elsewhere. And as you've said, sometimes under diplomatic cover, but not always. And it's those who operate with that malign intent are the ones that naturally we are interested in. And, given the international nature of that threat, that is a very obvious area of collaboration with allied services and countries. In that it really is a sort of shared risk and a shared threat. Then potentially, depending on where they're from, they have an interest in industry and espionage around industry, which is a concern because ultimately that is something that impacts on the financial well-being of a state, and that is something that must also be the focus of our business. And in many cases, it's subtle behaviour. They seek to build up relationships at the diplomatic, business, commercial, local government, or national government. And when those relationships are developed, then to seek to influence, to gain access, and to continue from there. And then this whole area is very closely aligned to cyber security activities and threats that, again, are associated with malign governments. It's an interesting area of business in that it is, of course, so closely associated with diplomatic relations of a state. And therefore, it's not always a comfortable area to speak about publicly. So I tend not to name the countries of concern, but it's an area of focus, it's an area of business, and it's a growing area of business. But in many respects, it is very different in that the threat posed plays out very differently in terms of time, in terms of scale, in terms of behaviour. So, it's not as if we're looking at acts of violence in this jurisdiction or threats of violence. It's very different to that.
When you started doing this, joining as becoming a constable and then moving over to this world, was there anything that was really surprising to you, or were things as you kind of expected them to be, albeit just a little bit different in real life, or was it like, holy smoke, I actually didn't really realise all this stuff was going on underneath the hood?
Yeah, I think the latter, and even though when I came in here, I was a relatively experienced detective and had been for a number of years before I moved into this world. So I think I was probably surprised at, some of the collection methodologies that were available, some of those international engagements to find yourself quite quickly sent abroad to meetings and, to find yourself in sort of iconic buildings and think, I really didn't think this place existed
like
outside.
The Spy Museum.
Well, like the Spy Museum. To find yourself at these places that I didn't think really existed outside of movies sometimes, but they very much did. And, to become part of the discussion and considerations around plotting for, ultimately what we're sort of monitoring the plotting into things that were quite outrageous, and to think that most of the world goes by and doesn't know these things are happening and are better off not knowing it, because many of them are sort of false flags. They don't emerge as real threats, but other things certainly do. And, I think people should in general take comfort from the work that is done by intelligence services and the exceptional collaboration that there is with these services to keep people safe. And that is not just at home, that's abroad. Where we come into possession of a piece of intelligence, that we feel will be of value elsewhere, we'll share that elsewhere, because ultimately we're mindful of the threat that elsewhere might be.
To help you digest this episode, here's a 60-second snippet on some of Garda Síochána's backstory. The Irish War of Independence began in 1919 and came to a conclusion with the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921, which provided for the establishment of an Irish Free State. This was quickly followed by the Irish Civil War, with pro- and anti-treaty sides fighting from 1922 to 1923. The Royal Irish Constabulary was the police force in Ireland up to this time, but it was disbanded and eventually replaced by Garda Síochána. The Dublin Metropolitan Police, a separate entity which oversaw policing in the capital city, would likewise be incorporated into Garda Síochána to constitute the force we see today. If you want to learn about a fascinating spy from this period, look into the life of Eamon Ned Broy. He served in the Dublin Metropolitan Police and would secret files out to the Director of Intelligence for the IRA, Michael Collins. He would actually go on to become Garda Síochána's commissioner from 1933 until 1938. I was just wondering, does the Irish diaspora ever figure into your operations, your investigations and so forth, or not really?
Well, traditionally they certainly did in the area of Northern Ireland-related behaviour, and that could be seen, regrettably on occasions in the United States, where part of the Irish diaspora who might have been involved in donations and fundraising may not have fully understood or appreciated, the actual feeling on the ground in Ireland about some of the groupings that they sought to support. So, we were talking about groupings, for example, with these various dissident groups. They do not have between them all a single elected representative, even in a local government, even in a county council. So they have no political support, and they have no support from the public, and that was demonstrated in the huge numbers that voted in favour of the Good Friday Agreement in North and South of Ireland. But that is pretty much disappearing now as an issue. It certainly was an issue during the Pirate campaign. It continued for a time for some of these other so-called dissident groupings, but we certainly see less of it now. That's been the principal area that we have seen it in my time here.
Do you find it gratifying? Are you enjoying the position?
I am, and I always have. But I say to new entrants who come into this particular business area that you have to be a sort of internally motivated person, because you will see the successes playing out operationally. So when the special branch bring the case before the court, when the emergency response unit do the hard stop and make the arrests, your role as an intelligence officer will never be identified. Your critical role in finding the little nugget that started this process going to that intervention, that media spotlight. So when everybody goes to the bar the night of that conviction or that big operational success, you won't be invited, because none of those people involved in that intervention even know what your role was in the operation. So that takes quite a different personality, a different way of viewing the world. So you have to be a person who can, take your satisfaction from knowing yourself the important role that you played in something that may well have become public, but your role in it certainly won't.
Are there any stories that have came out that you're able to talk about that fall within the remit of your branch?
There's one, it goes back to the time that Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth, travelled to Ireland in 2011. There were some intelligence indications of efforts that might be made to disrupt that visit. Few of them played out. There was 2 or 3 which we managed to disrupt, but one sort of blindsided us on the evening before the Queen was due to arrive here in May 2011. there was a phone call to a police station in County Longford in the middle of the country, which indicated that bombs had been placed on a bus that was going from the west of Ireland to Dublin at Sinn Féin's head office in Dublin at Bus Áras, which is a central bus station in Dublin. And as you would expect, that led to a series of searches, etc., and nothing was recovered at the physical locations. But the bus between Ballina, which is in County Mayo, and Dublin, was stopped out on the outskirts of Dublin, a place called Maynooth. And during a search of the baggage area, an improvised explosive device was discovered on the bus. And this was a bus with a number of passengers on it. So our colleagues in the military assisted with an explosive ordnance team to disrupt the device. But subsequent analysis indicated that it was a viable blast incendiary device. And so you can imagine if that had detonated the day before the Queen's visit, the implications that would have had. And of course, when that turned out to be sort of, if you like, a valid threat, a series of searches had to conduct and be redone throughout the night in terms of the wider security. So our department were deployed at that stage to do some work to try and work backwards to see what we could do. So needless to say, the point of key interest was the phone call. And we discovered that it was made from a burner phone. But closer analysis of the SIM card did demonstrate that it had been used or associated with a phone in the United Kingdom previously. And we, in real time, dealt with our colleagues in the security services in the north who were working on trying to establish the ownership of that phone. But something else we discovered was a top-up on the SIM card. And we recovered the CCTV of the location where that happened in the vicinity and identified an individual on that footage. And subsequently, it then also appeared that that individual was likely to be associated with the Northern Ireland phone that historically had been associated with the SIM card. So that threw up a personality to us of interest. And we decided to intensify surveillance around him to look at opportunities. And on the night of the 20th of May, the Queen was present in Ireland, and she was there was a state banquet at Dublin Castle, which was famous in that the Queen made some opening remarks in Irish, and that was something that was of international interest and of huge interest here in Ireland. But at around the time that happened, the target who was under surveillance made a further phone call to the same police station to indicate now that there was a further bomb in Dublin Castle. But at this point in time, he was under active and live surveillance and was arrested by a surveillance team. And in a follow-up search, then a firearm was recovered in his home. So he was a guy called Donald Billings, and he was subsequently convicted of possession of explosives, making false report, and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison before our special criminal court. You know, that's sort of a kind of a topical case at one moment in time. It became topical here in Ireland again recently because there was a documentary program about it.
I was just wondering, what does the future hold for you, Michael? Is this seen as a final position before you leave, or is this seen as when Drew Harris leaves, you may throw your hat in the ring and maybe you'll come back on the show as the commissioner in a few years, or do you already have your slippers bought and your pipe looked out and you're ready to down tools? Yeah, what does the future hold for you?
Well, wait for this for a diplomatic answer, but I guess I'm just in this role since February, despite a lot of history in this world and in various departments. So this is the chance at sort of heading it up, if you like. I see some great opportunities for some development here of this area. So that's what I'd like to focus on. I can serve on until I'm 60, so that gives me a number of more years.
that's exciting. You've been in the job since February, so I'm guessing you're probably just now getting your head around it all and you're ready to start making the changes you want to make.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And look, there's plenty there. I'm not in the world of changing things for the sake of it. Plenty works very well, but I think there are some changes that we can, with the various managers and the teams that work on them, find better ways of doing things too, and be open to new opportunities and new technologies, and that's the exciting part of this world too.
Well, thanks ever so much. This has been really great. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of SpyCast. Please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have feedback, you can reach us by email at spycast@spymuseum.org or on Twitter @INTL_SpyCast. If you go to our page at thecyberwire.com/podcast/SpyCast, you can find links to further resources, detailed show notes, and full transcripts. I'm your host, Andrew Hammond, and my podcast content partner is Erin Dietrich. The rest of the team involved in the show is Mike Mincy, Memphis Von III, Emily Coletta, Emily Renz, Afua Anokwa, Elliot Peltzman, Trey Hester, and Jen Ivan. This show is brought to you from the home of the world's preeminent collection of intelligence and espionage-related artifacts, the International Spy Museum.